Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is a Source Saturday video series within a series. Today I am talking with people related to comic books. The idea of Source Saturday was to introduce teachers and other educators to primary and secondary sources that can challenge the ways we normally teach particular time periods. And what I'm doing with this series of videos is I am talking with people related to comic books about how we can bring things like imagination, magic realism, Afrofuturism to our study of history. I've talked to people that are in the process of creating graphic novels, people that have published things as independent artists and writers, people who are Eisner Award nominated graphic novelists. I've talked with professors. I've talked to people interested in digital humanities. I've talked to so many people, and this series is so wonderful. Watch them one by one, or listen to them one-on-one, or watch them independently. But together, they really demonstrate the richness of teaching and learning history when we bring in space for art and imagination and interpretation. So enjoy these conversations. In this video, we are talking with Eisner Award nominee cartoonist Scott Chantler. If you know the comic book scene, especially in Canada, Scott Chantler's name is probably not unfamiliar to you. He's amazing. He's funny. He does a lot of the different book events and things like that. So he's really kind of out there and an all-around nice guy. If you're a teacher that doesn't know a lot about comic books and graphic novels, you might remember that he has done Two Generals, which is a really popular book used in a lot of schools across Canada. But we are talking today about his new book called Bix, which is about legendary jazz musician from the 1920s. This is not a Canadian history per se, but because the book is about the 1920s jazz scene, this book has such great, beautiful illustrations. Scott just does such a great job of like bringing up so much humanity in his drawings that it is a wonderful resource to be able to bring into your classroom to learn about the 1920s, learn about this jazz musician, and also like the trials and tribulations of his life. So anyway, I can't wait to talk to Scott about this new book. Let's go over to Zoom. Scott, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to me. I'm so excited to be able to talk about your new book that came out this summer, and just like all around how wonderful and evocative your art is for using to learn history. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me.
Well, thank you. You're very kind.
Well, I try. But it is also very genuine. I've been a big fan of your work for a while. Do you want to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is Scott Chantler. I'm a Canadian cartoonist. I've been doing comic books and graphic novels for, about 17 years now, I guess. If you're Canadian, you probably know me best for this book, Two Generals, which is taught in high schools and universities all over the country. This is my first kind of visit Bix, which we'll be talking about today, which you just held up, but I'm also going to hold up because you can't hold up the book enough times, really.
No, you can't.
I am, there it is again. See, it's just going to keep coming back.
They're everywhere.
Yeah, this is really my first historical-based book since Two Generals. It's been about a decade. It took that long for me to want to go back to something that involved that much research. It was kind of good to be back to some historical-based stuff.
Well, maybe I am forgetting this and I should know it, but I know Two Generals was based on your family, but Bix you don't have a personal connection to, correct?
No, I mean, other than just being a fan.
Right.
No actual family connections or anything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm a big fan of Two Generals, and that's how we met. Originally, you came and did a workshop and bit of a keynote for a day that I had at the Archives of Ontario. And so, yeah, it's really exciting to talk about Bix, which will just stay here
Yes.
along with Two
Yeah.
Generals
There. Yeah.
for our talk.
It's
Yeah.
on screen. Yeah. It's good.
It's there. It's there. Just casual. That's where I leave all my books. So
I really enjoyed that visit to the archives, by the way. That was one of my favorite author visits I've done anywhere. It's such an interesting,
awesome.
such an interesting environment there, and really interested crowd and all that stuff. So yeah, that was a memorable one.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a really great day because there was a mix of teachers that had used the book without like your intervention, and then teachers who hadn't been introduced to the book. So to be able to have you talk to like those groups and then also be able to like foreground the archival pieces that as part of it, I also thought it was just such a great event, and it was awesome to bring you in.
Cool.
Yeah, well, so we're doing it virtually. This will be your best virtual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is what we get in these times.
Yeah. I guess it could be worse. Yeah. I mean, let's not imagine it, but it probably could be worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't you tell us about Bix? What is Bix about, just in general?
All right, well, I'm going to share screens with you.
Let's do it.
I can show you. Where is my PDF? There it is. Share. Look, there's Bix Beiderbecke himself.
Yay!
Yeah. So the book is about Bix Beiderbecke, who was a jazz cornet player and pianist in the 1920s. He was really the first white jazz musician to really, contribute much to the development of that genre. And he was a character. He was in and out of trouble during his brief life, and died very young due to just horrible rampant alcoholism, which at the times it was the Prohibition era, and I know this is for history students who may eventually be looking at that, but Prohibition was a law in the U.S. that had the exact opposite effect of what it was intended to have, in which, because drinking was illegal, everyone ended up drinking just a lot more than they should have to buck what they saw as an unfair law. So, it was no coincidence that jazz really developed during that Prohibition era, because speakeasies were a big thing, and every speakeasy had to have a house band, and the history of Prohibition and early jazz are very intertwined, but also, as you can imagine, led to a lot of self-destruction on the part of some of those artists. So, that's in a nutshell what the book is about. Is about this very brief life during a very turbulent time.
And so, why Bix of all the jazz musicians?
Well. Bix is an interesting character because he was, a bit of an outsider. It's weird to think of like a, middle-class white guy from Iowa as being an outsider in anything. But in the world of jazz at the time, it was very much very much a black music coming up out of New Orleans at the time. It was brand new. White people were just hearing it for the first time. Maybe maybe that was their first kind of narrow glimpse into a more African-American world. And some of them were horrified by it. Some of them were enthralled by it, as Bix was. And, like a lot of white musicians that would follow in his wake, he wanted to be a part of it. And, obviously, we get into questions of sort of cultural appropriation and stuff at this point, is, how much of them being involved with it is too much? How much is getting involved in the wrong way? How many, that kind of thing. It's another interesting thing about having released this book at this time, which has, made me think a lot about those issues, which I also thought a lot about while I was making the book. So yeah, Bix is an outsider in a lot of ways. He just, there was nothing in his life that suggested this guy's going to become a jazz musician. He did not tick any of the boxes. Culturally, geographically, politically, anything. So, I like that. And I think a lot of artists can relate to Bix. I think a lot of the origins of the book and why I picked Bix is for that outsider quality, which a lot of artists kind of feel. That there is a rebellious quality to most artists, or, we'd all be, Wall Street traders or something. I think every artist feels a little bit like they.
I like that. That's the extreme: artist or Wall Street
right.
trader. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I was just trying to think of the exact opposite, and that's what I came up with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would go with like a banker too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. My dad worked in a bank, and I don't think he likes it when I use banker as an example of a stuffed shirt. But what are you gonna do?
One of the things that I really love about your artwork in your historical work, and I don't know if you remember, because I would have told you this when we met at the archives almost 10 years ago or whatever, but because I read your stuff about like Detroit Motown as well, because I'm a big fan of that era. So one of the things I really love about your artwork is that there's an element that seems very familiar. So like, when you look at the artwork, like I feel like a young person, for example, can see themselves in that. But then there's also this really interesting attention to detail so that it's historically, like it's a different historic period. Like I love the way it kind of goes back and forth like that. What were elements of the art that you really wanted to bring in here, especially related to like the time period and his life, that you wanted to bring into this particular reading of his life? Or I guess it's not reading, this particular viewing of his life?
Yeah.
Like, what do you read? Like, do you read a wordless graphic novel?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're getting pretty
this is a bigger question.
Theoretically here about the form, but I think of it as reading. Like,
okay, that's fine.
Like I think very much with comics, you sort of read the pictures.
Right. Yes.
But yeah, but that's. Who knows? Someone else might describe it some other way and also be perfectly accurate. So
I was talking to a hip hop musician, a hip hop historian, and I was like, "So this hip hop song," and I'm like, "That sounds very wrong," but also right. So it's kind of a similar moment.
Well, yeah, it kind of shows how unspecific language can be sometimes in trying to describe what art does. Like writing about art, I think must be very difficult if you're a critic or an academic or whatever, because as rich and varied as the English language is, art is so specific and so, but at the same time so kind of ephemeral that I don't know how you sometimes pin it down in words, and we just tripped over one example of that right there. But so back to the book itself. Yes, I always try to. I like an art style, obviously, that is very kind of simple and clean and easy to look at, and therefore easy to quote unquote read. But also, as you said, I kind of like enough detail in there for it to seem very specific at the same time. And so, when I'm doing historical stuff, it's, I try not to beat the reader over the head with the time period. I mean, you see a lot of art that does that, but you just have to be specific. If a guy walks into a room and there's a lamp on the desk, it's got to be a period lamp and a period desk. And, it doesn't have to be front and center, but it's got to, it's got to feel right. It's got to be convincing, or the whole thing just falls apart. With Bix, I also didn't want to hit people over the head with the time period too much, because I wanted to be clear that it's kind of a story that could have happened in any time period. That this is just, often the way artists live, often the way artists self-destruct. We've seen a lot of other examples just in music of, doomed musicians like Bix. But something else the art is doing, and I'm going to share screens with you again here.
Great.
Actually, I'm going to flip to the pages I want, and then I'm going to share screens.
We're so tech savvy.
Oh, aren't we good?
We're the best.
Yeah. So good. Did I do it? Are we sharing?
No.
We're not sharing. Okay. All right. Maybe not that tech savvy. I did put you.
Oh,
up
I
in
was
the
being
corner,
facetious, so.
Okay. Here we go. Share this and share. There we go. Now we're sharing.
Great.
Something else that the art does that I really wanted to, as much as I could, describe music and the making of music and the feeling of music through the comics form. Because in comics, you're replacing all the other senses with the visual. Mm-hmm. And the traditional for shorthand for comics and music is to have a guy tooting a horn and having a couple of little musical notes coming out the end of it. And I wanted to do something a little more sophisticated than that. So, mostly what the book does is that, as you see here, when it's kind of normal, boring, everyday life, back home in Iowa or wherever, here he's at his boarding school. The book is laid out in these strips, 5 panels per page, each panel the same size and shape. And, it has a very kind of staccato, boring rhythm to it, as life sometimes does. When he discovers classical music, he was taught the piano as a very small child and was a bit of a prodigy with that. Those panels start to bounce up and down like musical notes. So that's how classical music is represented in my book. When he gets into jazz, as in his late teens, the panels just start to go all over the place. This is a 2-page spread from somewhere in the middle of the book where he plays with Louis Armstrong in an after-hours jam session. Behind locked doors, of course, because it's the era of segregation. And then eventually, at his height, Bix sort of combines European classical music and American jazz into this hybrid in a really cool and astonishing composition called In a Mist. And so this is as complicated as the book gets right here, where the classical music structure is laid over a jazz structure. And so, yeah, I'm really trying to use the form of comics to visually represent the musical sounds that we're hearing or not hearing, as the case may be.
Did you have do you have a recommended soundtrack, like of songs that you would recommend people like listen to while reading certain pages?
Yeah, I really don't, and I avoided doing that just because I wanted the story to feel very universal. I was talking earlier about how all artists kind of feel this way, and a lot of people in general kind of feel this way. About maybe being out of their place and time, and having to fight all these kind of cultural things to do what they want to do, and so because I wanted to have that kind of timeless, universal feel, I didn't want to tie it to Bix's music specifically. Like when you're reading the book, I just want it to be clear that he's doing something creative and a little different, and it doesn't really matter what it is specifically. So I kind of avoided putting like a little Spotify playlist or something in the back that you could check out or something. I thought about it briefly, but then I thought, nah, that makes it a little too specific. But I do hope people will be tempted to go out and check out Bix's music, which is, it's like 100 years old now, nearly.
Yeah. Yeah.
His recordings and music from that time might seem a little alien to most people's ears, but you can certainly kind of train yourself a little bit to hear it, and if you can hear it in context, it's it's really interesting and creative and personal music that he was making.
Well, it's
So
also
check it out. Go search up some Bix Beiderbecke. But there's no specific list. There's a few song titles in the book that you can check out, which are the real important ones. But go to wherever you stream music and pull up Bix and listen to a bit for sure.
Well, it's an interesting assignment or an activity to do that, because I hadn't heard of Bix before your graphic novel. And so I had listened to some of his music in anticipation of it coming out. And it was really interesting. And to think of like putting together, like being inspired by reading it and putting together a playlist of this time period is kind of an interesting activity for students too, because then they can use this material and use other material to be able to kind of come up with this sound landscape of the 1920s. And I think music was such a key element of so many things that we used to learn about the 1920s.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was an amazing time for culture in general, really.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on in the 20s.
Well, it was, I guess that's what's going to happen to us next, because they had a pandemic and then all of this rich culture happened.
Right. Yes. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed that it goes that way and not some other horrible way.
But that's, come up a lot.
I think you're breaking up you're breaking up a little bit.
Okay.
I can barely. Yeah, okay. I think it might have improved just a little there. Yeah, I was having trouble. You were frozen for a bit, and I was having a little trouble getting your audio there for a bit.
Okay, are you okay now?
Are we back? Yeah, that seems to be a little. It's
Okay.
still telling me your bandwidth is low, but
My
I can
bandwidth
definitely
is
see
low?
and hear you better.
Fine.
That's what it's telling me. Dumb.
So judgy, because you're buffering a little, but generally you're fine. Otherwise, I would have gotten you to re-record something.
Gotcha.
Are you okay? Ready? We'll try again.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're better. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So that's come up a lot, actually, when we've talked about history teaching during the pandemic, that like, for me, for example, I'm rethinking the Roaring 20s in a different way because of the experience of understanding the Spanish flu differently than I would have before. Are there elements of this book that you are thinking about differently because of this time period? You in your when you're introducing it, you kind of suggested like you're thinking about like the Black Lives Matter, cultural appropriation a little bit differently. Any other things that you're pulling from this period that are kind of surprises?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, the book doesn't really get into Spanish flu or there's a little bit of First World War stuff because his older brother came home from the war with a record player and the first jazz recording, coincidentally enough. And that was what first got Bix hooked. But, we don't really address, the war or its aftermath at all. But it really is that sort of, racial stuff, which is all throughout the book. Mm-hmm. But Bix was released in April, and then all the George Floyd stuff, the Black Lives Matter stuff, really erupted in the States in May. And, I just felt so, I don't know. It was a bad time to be releasing a book anyway, because all the bookstores were closed and all the pandemic stuff was going on. But then suddenly in May, I'm out there hawking a book about a white jazz musician. And, the book addresses a lot of that stuff, but or at least touches on it, but you've got to at least get people to read it. And, it's a weird time to be bringing this book out. I think it's a bit of a tough sell, but I hope people will read it because it does it does at least touch on the idea of Bix's privilege and all that stuff that we're all so keenly aware of now. But you really, when it comes to the 20s and my thinking during the book and my thinking since, it's mostly about race and Bix's relationship to the music he was making and the culture it came from. It's interesting. Where does tribute and influence and inspiration stop and appropriation begin? I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I know the answer. I'm sure Bix was on the correct side of it. I mean, if Louis Armstrong was cool with Bix, there's no reason why you and I shouldn't have been. But like I say, a lot of the white musicians that came along after Bix were maybe not quite so as reverent and willing to respect the source.
Well, I mean, one of the things I was talking to with the hip hop historian, as I had mentioned, and I'll link to that video, is that there's like a hip hop culture that like speaks back to dominant structures and that is raced. But if you are part of that culture and you're speaking back, you don't need to be raced in that certain way. And I think that comes from a long tradition of this type of music that is meant to be that is meant to call back or to push back to a society that isn't providing space for these different types of cultural expression and experiences. And that's why I think this is an interesting book to also be able to have those conversations about like a history of cultural appropriation, but how that's not always the case. Like I would talk about this related to 1950s music a lot of the times. And, for that was like radio sales. And so it really was just appropriation because I just wanted the radio sales. But when you're in a speakeasy and you're doing jazz in this like basement or, all these different things, it's kind of different. It's like, well, it's about like, where's the money going? And if there's not a lot of money, then, you can see more about the art.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
very, very interesting. Yeah, I hope the book will spark some conversations of that type, and I hope it won't just put people off because I don't know that I have a lot of answers in there, but there might be a lot of conversation starters in there. So hopefully that'll be the case, and hopefully people will discover it for that purpose.
So how do you think a teacher could use a book like this in their classroom to help challenge how we normally talk about the 1920s? Because I feel like we're talking about that a little bit now, but maybe you can be a little bit more specific in how you think that this can challenge how we understand this period. Well,
that's a really good question. I always find it really, like with Two Generals, for instance, as I said at the beginning, it's a book that's been very popular in schools at the high school and post-secondary level. And I'm always amazed at the variety of ways in which teachers use it. I don't think I would deign to, suggest anything when, I've seen how creative teachers can be and how many great ideas they have. The first school board to adopt Two Generals was the Thames Valley Board. And I was able to come in one time and see how all the teachers were using it. They kind of presented to me, the different kind of lessons they were using the book for. And man, they were using the book in English, they were using it in history, they were using it in art, and in all completely different ways. So I really, your question is such a big question, and I don't even know. I mean, I'm not a professional educator, clearly. And, these people who are, they know their stuff and they have ideas and big ideas and creative ideas. And teachers are amazing to me.
Well, I mean,
So,
I thought that was a softball question because I
see, I thought it
actually
was a really hard one.
sorry about that, because one of the things that I think that we can use to challenge how we teach history with something like this is when we talk about the Roaring Twenties, we often talk about it in these really glamorous ways, right? And
Well, that's true. There's the kind of Great Gatsby kind of martini glass and tuxedo sort of vibe that the 20s suggests to people, and that that stuff is in my book too. But you also get to see what happens after the show, where everybody's drunk and hallucinating.
right, like you can
Yeah,
see
exactly.
that more
Yeah,
seedy side, and also
yeah,
I'm trying to find the pages. I should have marked them better, but I didn't want to like mark up the book. But also like that mix between like high art and low art that
right.
because he was white, he was able to do. Like, again, we think so often about the 1920s and like this little cultural period of like fun, gorgeous, speakeasies. And I'm like thinking in particular about like women's makeup being like perfect. But there was
Right.
alcohol and there were drugs and there was a blend of high art and low art that some people were able to access that not others. And so I thought it was a lowball question because like we've talked about these things in this conversation, and that's why it's such a cool book to be able to kind of like bring up to talk about those things. So sorry
Yeah,
if I threw you off.
no, hey, it's all right. It gave me an excuse to compliment teachers.
Yeah. I mean, and like I know the stuff that teachers have done with Two Generals is amazing, and that's why I think
Yeah.
that they can do such amazing stuff with this as well. Just even in talking about the way that you structure the different panels, and I was going to use this question to wrap up, but one of the things I was talking about with the group of 7 guys, Chris Sanigan and Jason Lapidus, is about, or Jason in particular, the artist, about how did it feel to draw somebody that was a real person and not like a character. And so maybe
Right.
as a way to like kind of conclude our conversation, I always like to suggest teachers bring in art in teaching history, which is another challenge to that. But like maybe you could provide some like suggestions of like how it felt, or reflections of how it felt to draw somebody that was a real person and that you wouldn't have been able to like see his body and all the different motions you drew him in. Like, are there pieces of advice you could give to teachers to give to students about maybe engaging in this work as an assignment, like to create their own graphic novel about this period, for example?
Yeah. I mean, I've had 2 different experiences with that. In that, the book about my grandfather I did, Two Generals. I knew the man.
Right.
I knew my grandfather well until I was about 25, and it wasn't that difficult for me to imagine him at the age of 30.
Right.
And so, I went with old photographs and just my own experience of the man himself. With Bix, that gets a little tricky because, there are some old photographs. I showed you one. There are even a couple of pieces of film that exist of Bix, not many, and just a few seconds here and there. So with Bix, I'm, there's a lot of frog DNA in with that dinosaur DNA, to use my Jurassic Park metaphor.
Dino DNA.
Dino DNA. Hopefully the kids will have seen Jurassic Park and they'll know what we're talking about. But I've had to put a lot of myself into Bix. I said earlier that I relate a lot to Bix.
Yeah.
I think a lot of artists would, and I think a lot of people would. So there's a lot more of me in Bix than there is of me in my grandfather in Two Generals, for instance.
Interesting.
It had to be a little bit more just my feeling of who Bix was, and that's really up in the air. By the way, I touch on this a bit in the introduction to the book, but there is. There are, as with anything in history, people have their specialties, and there are certainly historians out there who are very into Bix and researching Bix and picking his story apart and finding all the little bits and pieces and nooks and crannies in it and stuff. And they all have their opinion of who Bix was. And, you've got to negotiate all of that. And, there's a few biographies about him, which really informed my book. And they each have their own take. And as with anything, when you're doing history, you've got to decide kind of who was right, if two sources disagree. And so that really shapes your telling of the story and your interpretation of the character. And at every point, it is you making the decision. So, it's hard to get away from the fact that this is just your take on the character. So, yeah, I tried to really steer right into that and just, be very clear that this is a kind of a universal story I'm telling about artists and about myself. And Bix's experience surely must have been something close to it. So there was a lot more, there was a lot more educated guesswork, but guesswork for sure, and just kind of flying by instinct when it came to Bix.
I know you're talking about illustration, but I think that's actually the case for most histories that we write or draw or speak. And I think that's a really kind of interesting way to think about our work in doing this, and your work in particular with this this piece of work, because when you bring yourself into it, you are able to come up with nuances of a character that there are no records for, right? And so and so again, that's one of the reasons why I love your artwork, because I think it brings so much emotion in the drawing of a face that you wouldn't get necessarily from archival records that are out there.
I was really glad that I'd done Two Generals first when I did Bix, because working on Two Generals really convinced me, like you say, that there is really not any kind of objective history per se. No. You can nail down things like dates and stuff, but the truth of what actually did or didn't happen is very much open to interpretation. And having gone through the experience of research and creating Two Generals really, taught me that with Bix, I don't necessarily have to obsess over facts. That a more subjective truth is the thing to shoot for. Just to figure out what my interpretation is and do that. And you make a good point that with comics, you have to depict the thing. You can't just say Bix walked into the theater. You have to decide what Bix is wearing and his, what his, physical expression is that day, and what the theater looked like and the state it was in, and whether he was hungover or not. There's a lot of decisions to make when you're depicting the scene. It becomes more like directing a movie where you've got all these thousands of decisions to make on every page, and they all speak to story, and they can all speak to history or not, and you have to decide which details are the correct ones. And if you're making up details, you have to decide which ones are the most convincing and possibly the most accurate, or what you're going to use and what you're not. And it's complicated business doing a book like this. That's why I took a decade between Two Generals and Bix.
Well,
I had to forget.
It was worth it.
I had to forget how much work it was. Yeah.
It was worth it. The book is beautiful. I learned so much from it. I was, even just like knowing who Bix is, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk about it and thinking about history generally and how it can be drawn. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so we will connect maybe in the future on your next project. Hopefully it won't be 10 years because since we're done our pandemic, there'll be this big cultural revolution and you will be right in the middle of it.
Yes, we can hope. We can hope.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Samantha.
Bye.
Bye-bye.